Welcome to the first episode of Al Podcast, a trilingual show presented in French, English, and Arabic. My name is Mustafa Habballah, and this podcast will cover a wide range of subjects, including politics, religion, philosophy, and health. Today, we have the honor of hosting a distinguished guest, Professor Michelle Hartman. Professor Hartman is a renowned scholar of Arabic literature at McGill University. She has authored influential books such as Native Tongue Stranger Talk, Breaking Broken English, and Women War Stories, the Lebanese Civil War, Women's Labor, and the Creative Arts. Additionally, she is a highly respected literary translator known for her translations of novels, memoirs, and short story collections. Beyond her academic achievements, Professor Hartman is a passionate advocate for Palestinian rights, advocating for Palestinian indigenous resistance, and characterizing Israel's actions as colonialism and apartheid. We are thrilled to have her with us today to delve into the complexities of literature, colonialism, and resistance. كيفك ميشيل؟
الحمد لله. كيفك أنت؟
الحمد لله. يلا
مصطفى.
بلشنا. Okay. In your book, Native Tongue Stranger Talk, you quote the Lebanese writer Nadia Twaini. Writing in French is writing in bourgeois, writing in rich, writing in privileged students from privileged schools where one pays dearly for the glory of becoming the byproduct of a certain West. Écrire en français égale écrire en bourgeois. Écrire en riche, écrire en élève privilégié ou en paix, cher la gloire de devenir un sous-produit d'un certain Occident. What can you tell us about the female voice in Arabic literature?
I took that quotation from Nadia Twaini to try to talk a bit about the distance that people have from their lived language when they write or live in a colonial language. So I used that quotation and the book that it as from to study in more detail how, in this case, women writers, but writers in general, kind of react and are able to express something of their lived experience and of their lived language inside another language. So the study is to look at how Arabic is used inside of French in writings by French language authors in Lebanon, like Twaini herself, Nadia Twaini, who herself couldn't write in Arabic because she wasn't Arabic educated, though Arabic was her language of expression. So that's kind of where that quote comes from, and that's what I was talking about there, that real kind of tension when you are brought up with and learn to read and write in maybe more than one language, or you learn to read and write in one language, but you live and speak and have your main life in another language.
I chose that quote, honestly, because I thought it was pretty interesting, because I was born here, but originally from Lebanon, and we all have that perspective that whomever speaks and writes in French comes from a certain background. Mm-hmm. When I read it, I thought, wow, it's actually deeper than that, right? Not everybody that's actually reading or writing in French is actually necessarily happy about that. It's you could see with Nadia Twaini, who's the mother of Jubran Twaini, the writer of Al-Nahar. You could see how she's actually struggling with that language, maybe because she can't relate necessarily with everybody in the country she lives in.
Well, and so exactly this idea of kind of how you can express yourself in a colonial language, in this case French, but this is also similar to English, and this is true of people inside Lebanon. I mean, this study is done inside Lebanon, but obviously, here in Quebec, we talk so much about languages and mixing languages and the different interaction with languages. We here are very sensitive to this language question, right? That there's a lot of complexity inside of it. You might really love the language you go to school in. You might really master it, like somebody like her was clearly really, really brilliant in French. But at the same time, that doesn't mean you feel fully connected to it, that you can fully express yourself in it, or that it really is well suited to being a language to deliver your experiences or all of your experiences. So she's not really the only one. There are so many authors in that study, but also just in the world, who really relate to this kind of tension with the language that they use to write in.
Okay. And you mentioned the word study, so I'm assuming during that book you did a lot of research. What exactly did you do? Could you give us a brief summary?
So in this big study that I did of all of these different novels and a little bit poetry, I went through and took out these sections where Arabic is being used inside the French text. And what I found when I put them next to each other and analyzed them was that there are several different kinds of trends in what the Arabic was being used for. So less than being, as I was just saying now, less than being exotic or spicy or adding local color or local flavor and so on, they actually were talking a lot about culture, about traditions, so of course about food and other things like this, but also making commentaries about the roles of women and how women fit into society and things about gender. Also things about religion and religious belonging and how in Lebanon people of different backgrounds might get along together or not. Also kind of views of colonialism and different kinds of political messages. So far from being texts that are sort of written in French, so therefore they are snobby or they're right-wing or they're fascist, there's actually a lot more that's really interesting going on in these texts. The majority of them I would characterize in that way. So it was a really pretty interesting study.
Okay. You mentioned the word study. As far as your research goes, is there any study or research that talks about the illiterate woman? The reason I mentioned the illiterate woman is that I looked at a study. It went from between 75% to 90% of women that were born in the 1930s, like Nadia Twaini, like my grandmother, were illiterate. My grandmother, I feel like, did her own kind of resistance in a sense where she raised a generation that loved their land, their countries, for example. When I was younger, I used to spend the whole summer in Lebanon. She'd come, I'd wake up early and she'd come and just take the control of the TV, and she'd put in some morning supplications, and she'd wouldn't say a word. She couldn't even read what's on the TV. However, like she would hum, and as if she was telling me, like, listen, Mustafa, this is very important for you. Then my grandmother, by the way, she was a magnetic person. Everything revolved around her. When she was in the room, she knew she was in the room. She'd call me for a subhi and drinking coffee in the morning. She'd talk to me about like how our country is beautiful, how we should take care of our land. And I feel like I'm not the only one that lived that experience. I'm pretty sure a lot of people in the South that fought the occupation of Israel in 78 and 82 lived that experience. And I was wondering, like, if there was somebody that gave those illiterate women a voice.
It's such a really good point, an interesting point, and there's sort of, I could say way too many things about it, but let me like kind of answer your question in a couple of different ways. I mean, one is that as you kind of allude to, when we study literature, and that's like in the university, and we study literature, we usually aren't studying people who are literate, right? Those are people who kind of get left out of these kinds of studies, and we study, let's say, the works of the women who were writing, right? Because when we study poetry and we study literature that's written, those are the people who make it into kind of academic study more. So one way to answer that is that obviously the women whose works I was reading for the study were people who could read and write. And there's some in those texts, excuse me, depiction of women like your grandmother and women that you're talking about. Some, not a lot, right? There's like mostly these are not the images that are portrayed, or if they are portrayed, they're a very small element. And I think that has to do with wanting at a certain moment in time to present kind of literary works that are seen to be more modern, right, quote unquote. And so we get an image very often, let's say, of the rural life or life in the South that is very either romanticized, right? So it's not the real life, right? It's like everything is perfect and amazing. And so like the older woman is very, very wise, or right, you have those kinds of things where, you know, the men are working very, very hard on the land. So they're almost not real. Or they sometimes have the opposite side where it's like everybody's very, very oppressed. And so everything is very, very terrible, right? And so we don't have a lot of images. But I'll tell you one place that we do that it might be a little bit interesting to talk about is in a different project that I was engaged in working on with my colleague Malik Abi Saab, who I think you might know. And we together went and interviewed women, not only from the South, but mainly from the South, who were involved in different kind of political and resistance work. And we asked them to tell us their stories about what they lived in the war, starting in 1975, just anything that they wanted. And through those stories of women just talking about their experiences, which we later then collected and edited and published as a book, it's just come out, that's where we get so many stories like you're talking about. And I think it's so important because they are experiences that so many people have and that are like really, really common, but they're also really, really extraordinary. Like the way that women like your grandma and other women really held together and still hold together families, people, but also the land and also the memories and also the spirit of what it means to resist, and not just either in the kind of very romantic way or very kind of oppressed way, but the real life stories that people go through when they have a challenge that needs to be resisted. And so that's where we talk to just person after person after person with incredible stories, amazing stories that they presented to us as just, you know, life. That's just how you do things. And I think that's really, really something for us to pay attention to when we think about sort of who's important and whose stories are important and what stories and what we need to learn, right? Because they offer us so much to learn from.
Yeah, she was, and I'm pretty sure they all were incredible.
Yeah.
And okay, and during the research, how did actually that research lead you to the Palestinian plight? Or I'm pretty sure, I mean, you've known about the Palestinian plight prior, but I mean, if you could tell our audiences, how did you hear or when did your passion for literature open your eyes to the Palestinian plight?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, again, it's not sort of like one moment, but like you said, it's sort of like over a certain amount of time. I studied Arabic at university, so I was in my kind of like late teenage years, it was a long time ago. And sort of at the same time as I was at university, kind of studying all different things. I studied French literature, I studied English literature, and then I started studying Arabic so I could study Arabic literature together with learning language and culture and history and, you know, poetry and literature. This is where I think I learned so much about Palestine, and it's a kind of, politically, that question is one that if you are, you know, even studying it a little bit, right, as like a young person, your eyes become open very, very fast to its importance as a struggle for justice. So as someone who was concerned with other struggles for justice, that naturally became a place where I started to focus a lot of attention.
Was there an event that actually opened your eyes more than the others? Like, for example, a specific thing that the Israeli occupations did to Lebanon, did to Palestine, or it's just something you've just read with time and that gradually you've become closer and closer to?
I think more the latter. I mean, definitely, obviously, I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, and so those in the United States. So those kinds of images were things that we saw on the news or saw in the papers. But of course, you also know that the way that this is presented and to a Western audience is also very biased and very difficult to sometimes for some people to see the truth of. But I think so it's less kind of one moment, but and more kind of being in an environment where this is an important issue, just like I said, other issues for justice and other struggles for equality, where they kind of come together. Having said that, it's interesting, so I can't say that there's a moment that made me say, oh, this is what made, I watched something on TV and that made me, it wasn't like a moment like that. But in this moment today, where there's so much activism around the question of Palestine here in Montreal, and many of us are very, very involved with young people, it's made me go back and reflect on these questions a little bit, right? And thinking like, which moments do I remember? And so I was talking to some young people and saying, well, when I was your age, we were protesting against Oslo. And the students thought that was very funny, like, haha, you're not that old. And I was, yes, I actually am that old. But it's sort of, there are these kind of moments that are very important, I think, to think about kind of what the discourse was, what were we doing to reflect back on sort of how the challenges were being articulated that help us as, whether we're thinking about that in terms of organizing and activism and or as like analysts and people who are involved in politics, so that we can keep, do better and better in the future. Right?
You mentioned activism. So you've been a vocal advocate for the student encampment movement at McGill, which is part of a global movement of students protesting peacefully in solidarity with the Palestinian people and against the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Can you explain what the demands of these students are and what their end goal is?
Well, the student encampment at McGill and Concordia, like the other encampments in the States and all around the world, the main focus has been on divestment, right? So they have kind of a group of demands. It's, you probably heard the chants, right? So the chants, disclose, divest, and then the other two are declare and defend. So those four have been used by the students at McGill and Concordia and widely in Canada. So disclose is meant to ask the universities to say where their money is invested. So at McGill, the students by now more or less have done enough research and have put the demands forward for many years, and not just in relation to Palestine, but in other issues of justice like fossil fuels. So more or less students have some sense of where McGill's money is invested. At Concordia, this is less true. Concordia still has a lot of investments they need to disclose. So that's one of the reasons disclose is like the first demand for the McGill Concordia encampment. Divestment is moving your money, right? So we have heard about divestment in relation to South Africa, where there was a big push to say, we want all money that supports the apartheid racist regime in South Africa to move from South African companies to other places. So students are asking for the same thing. So investments that prop up the genocide. So that's not just about Israeli companies, but that's about our money here in Canada and in the US being taken out of companies that are arms manufacturers, especially that put research into surveillance technologies that, for example, surveil the wall, the apartheid wall in Palestine. So these companies that are complicit in the genocide, that McGill and Concordia and other universities should not have their investments in those companies, and they should move them into other companies that are not complicit in the genocide. So this is the most important demand that the students around the world are asking for. Move your money. They want to take the money out, to put pressure, international pressure. And then the other two, defend is to ask for amnesty for students who are being targeted either by state repression or by university repression for protesting. So do not put disciplinary charges, do not put criminal charges against people who are literally standing up for their right to protest against a genocide. So that's defend. And then declare is what they're asking the universities to say that this is wrong. They're asking for a simple statement from the universities that this is wrong. And McGill and Concordia have not been willing to do that. So those are the four main demands, and that's what they're there for. So they're not there for camping. They're not there for, it's not fun, right? They're really there to make this very, very important political point that they're against the genocide with these, really specific demands on the universities to fulfill.
Okay. And you've been in McGill, if I'm not mistaken, since 2002?
Yep.
Why do you feel like a prestigious university like McGill is involved in all of this?
Involved with their money in these
Exactly.
corporations. And
Israel
so on.
is a small country and it's far away from Canada. Why would they involve themselves in something that us as Canadians and Quebecers we consider awful?
Yeah, it is true, and the mainstream of public opinion, as we know in Montreal and Quebec and in Canada, even is obviously bigger, the bigger formation, right? The country are not in favor of genocide and are not in favor of supporting this military regime or apartheid state, right? The people here aren't, and so I think that we see that the elite institutions like McGill follow very closely what the federal government and in some cases the provincial government does. So, the federal government of Canada is very pro-Zionist and has been very friendly to Israel, as has Quebec recently, right, as well. So that's one thing. But also, when we start to look at investments and we look at the questions that the students are asking right now, we see how much the universities are involved in kind of corporate business and not just in the business of education, which is what people like me and professors tend to be the most interested in, which is educating the students, doing research, kind of making ideas about how to make the world a better place, and that the kind of corporate interests of the university come into play when we talk about divestment and making money. They're putting their maintaining their investments in places that they think will make more money. And obviously, some of that is in these things like weapons companies.
Okay. And do you think, and that's something you hear, but I mean, considering you've been involved at McGill for a long time, you can confirm or deny that, because I've heard that about the States, I'm not sure about Canadian universities, are donors influencing McGill's decisions?
I mean, I don't know enough about this to really answer it, to answer the question fully, like what is the role of donors? What I know is that McGill's a public university, like Concordia. They're both public universities. And so we, as the people, should have just as much say, if not more say, than anybody else in terms of what the university does with its money, how the university spends its money. I mean, we're not all experts to get into the fine points, but I think that it's right for us as the people to demand that our universities that are publicly funded not be putting their money into weapons companies. I think that that's a very ethical, principled, reasonable stand. And so clearly, universities like McGill do have donors. We know some of the university's prominent donors over time, as well as currently, are people who are very involved in big business and in corporate and have corporate interests, and some of them are pro-Zionist. That we know that, we can research that. I'll give you an example. So, I mean, just if we want to go back to the founding of McGill University, right? So McGill University is built on the former estate of James McGill. James McGill was a sugar merchant who owned slaves, right? The land was expropriated and is unceded land of the Ganigahaga people. So the founding of the university is founded on really similar principles to what's happening today in Palestine. So it's sort of not a surprise that over time that wouldn't have changed, right? So that's the founding of the university. When we did a project at the end of last semester where we took people on an alternative tour of the university, where we went from building to building and talked a little bit about what was happening in the different buildings in relation to the genocide. But along the way, we just looked at the names of the buildings. So this was sort of like background research for the tour. It wasn't the main part of the tour. So we researched Leacock, we researched Rutherford, we researched McDonald, like these are the names of buildings, right? And most of these buildings are named after former professors or alumni or people who were like donors, right? And almost all of the buildings that, McLennan was another one, that I researched, these were also people who supported things like white supremacy, racist ideologies, misogynist positions. Wow. So like Leacock was a white supremacist. He believed that the quote unquote Southern races weren't really well adapted to living here in the North. Right? So the kind of ideological foundations that the university is built on and the people who the university is celebrating, then I'm talking in the older times, not as recent as today, have upheld these very similar ideologies. So we see, if we research more contemporary donors or people who, let's say the buildings are named after, like Bronfman, and you research him, he is also someone who has supported the state of Israel in different ways and donated money to causes that are related to what is happening today in relation to the apartheids in that part in Palestine. So all of it's kind of connected to my mind, right? Like so it probably won't be a surprise when we find out that other people also hold similar ideologies. The important one for people maybe to look at today is Sylvan Adams. So Sylvan Adams is actually a Quebecois person who, I think he's from Quebec City. The listeners can look it up and confirm that, I'm pretty sure. And he donated a very, very large amount of money to build a sports center at McGill. It's under construction now, it's just starting. He is also a self-described ambassador of Israel who has been involved for many years in bringing Israeli sports around the world, in particular cycling. So that's how he describes himself. So when the students are protesting against this center, their slogan was "No Genocide Gym," right? They're looking at the connection of the way the university is taking money and naming a building after somebody who's proudly supporting what's happening today in Palestine. So it happened a really long time ago, and it's still happening today, and there's a lot of continuities in the story.
Well, thank you for that lesson. It's truly, I'm pretty sure the listeners did not know that information, and it's good that we shed light on that, right? Because, like you said, it's a public university, and we should be as involved. The students there, at least, should be as involved as whomever is investing in that company.
Absolutely.
Another question. Following both resignations of Liz McGill, president of University of Pennsylvania, and Claudine Gay of Harvard, has your opinion on academic freedom and censorship regarding Zionism in academia and self-censorship evolved since your 2014 interview under the in 2014, if you recall, and you discussed how nobody has ever told you to say or not say something, and that you had flexibility in terms of what subjects you want to talk about in your courses. Has that changed since post-October 7th?
No, that hasn't changed since post-October 7th. I think what is important to kind of think about is that so we are protected by academic freedom in our classroom teaching and in what we say. This is my area of research and this is what I work on. So people don't come into my class and say, you can't say this, you can't say that. I think that's one of the things that is a bit misunderstood about the way that, let's say, censorship or self-censorship works, right? So we're not operating in a system in the university where you start to talk and somebody comes in and says, you can't say that, right? But there's many other sort of ways in which this might work that make it hard sometimes for people to speak about certain kinds of things. There is informal pressure that can be exerted on you when you're in an academic space or in a non-academic space. There can be in universities like marginalization of people who talk about things in certain ways. Someone like me maybe would be considered to be say too much, or maybe I won't get invited to always be on all of the committees, or I won't be invited to come to certain kinds of lectures, right? And you know, because people who speak openly about certain political topics and the question of Zionism or the question of Palestine, you know, will make you not a desirable person to have on certain kinds of spaces, especially if you assert yourself in different kinds of ways, or if you are from a certain background and so on. So like white professors like me have an easier time of accessing more spaces than people of racialized backgrounds. That's something that we see a lot. Still, yeah. So I actually don't see a big change, you know, since October 7th per se. But one thing that I would say is that definitely because of how intense the situation is in Palestine and how the genocide has unfolded and how we are seeing it live in front of our eyes every day, more and more people are shocked and horrified and angry. And so more people are speaking up who have not usually spoken up in the past, right? The very small number of us who have worked on these issues now find ourselves, which is great, you know, with many more, you know, colleagues and supporters around us. And so many of those people are very surprised that when they stand up and say certain things, or that they maybe would think is obvious, or, you know, arguing for a ceasefire, or arguing against the murder of babies, like very obvious things, the kind of pushback that they get. So people maybe who've been talking in these ways for a long time maybe were a bit more used to the pushback. And so we see people who are facing a broader kind of repression. But it is true also that there have been some very organized and concerted attempts to shut down conversation. So there has been a revival of a very dishonest definition of anti-Semitism that has been circulating. The short name for it is the IHRA definition. People say IRA, like they pronounce out it's an acronym, right? So IHRA, which basically, I'm not going to go into all the details of it, but basically tries to equate anti-Zionism, like being against Zionism and the state of Israel, with anti-Semitism, which we don't agree with, right? It's not true. You can criticize a state, and that doesn't make you hate Jewish people, right? I don't hate Jewish people. I think it's terrible when people are anti-Jewish. Like most people I know, like pretty much everyone I know, we don't believe in anti-Muslim discrimination. We don't believe in anti-Jewish discrimination ever, right? We don't believe in it. But we do believe in the criticism of Zionism and what the state of Israel is doing very strongly, right? They're not the same thing. This definition wants to make them the same thing. And with this push for that and some other kinds of like political games that people have been playing have made it difficult for people to engage in a full critique in many kinds of settings, right? So there are, especially in the States, where there are laws passed and there are many different kinds of official ways to shut down conversation and debate. So at the same time, I say, okay, in my own specific job, I'm not facing somebody coming into my classes and telling me what I can and can't say. There is this bigger picture, which is making it difficult and increasingly difficult to make certain kinds of critiques and criticisms that we need to make today.
Okay. Activism can sometimes come with personal and professional risks. Organizations like Canary Mission, which claim to combat anti-Semitism but often target pro-Palestinian activists, have highlighted your advocacy. How has that scrutiny affected you?
Well, there's always that joke about Canary Mission, right? So if people don't know what it is, it's a website where they put like little pictures and little descriptions of what you've done that criticizes Israel. And so it's mostly students, but there's some professors there as well. Actually, right now there's quite a lot of professors. It started in the States and now they have like a Canadian branch. And so we always say that, we see our friends there. It's like, you see your former students say, oh, I wonder how they're doing, No, but then that's like a joke about it. But yeah, I mean, it is meant to be intimidating and it's meant to be scary and it's meant to tell you, it's that you're being surveilled and you're being watched. And the things that they put on that website, I mean, it does show the kind of gap in understanding of these issues because the things that they put on the website that I have said, proudly, I believe in the things that I've said that criticize the state of Israel. I don't, think that they're right. But at the same time, it's supposed to be, implying that somehow this is discriminatory or that this is racist or that I somehow, and all of the many colleagues and students who are on there are doing something that's wrong. And so this can be very chilling and can be very difficult to fight back against. And so, you might have to go and, defend, we might have to spend a lot of time, and I and other colleagues have spent a lot of time defending certain things that we've done that aren't wrong, or defending things that we've done or books that we've recommended, or so many different kinds of questions that's really not a very good use of our time when we're busy trying to fight against a really terrible thing, that we have to go and spend extra time defending ourselves against spurious claims that just aren't true. There are these different kinds of moves to shut people up and to shut people down. I don't think that they'll succeed because I think that the side of justice will kind of come through, but they do take a lot of time to fight against.
So you've also been known to be a vocal proponent of BDS. For our listeners who may not be familiar, can you explain what BDS is and what it aims to achieve?
So the BDS movement, the acronym BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. So before we were talking about divestment, that's the D, where we were talking about moving the money from place to place. So that's one of the pillars. There's the three parts of BDS, and divestment is the one that has to do with the money, and really institutional money, right? I mean, of course, as people, we can also do different things with our money, but we can't really divest unless we're much richer than you or I are. Sanctions is something that governments do, right? So we could push, for example, Quebec or Canada to put sanctions on Israel. So that's the idea of the S in BDS. So we have the divestment and the sanctions, which are these bigger kind of institutional frames. And then we have the B, which is boycott. And I think that the boycott is interesting to talk about as well, because we have the kind of boycott of consumer products, and I think maybe a lot of your listeners might know about the boycott of consumer products. You have the ones that are called for that are kind of worldwide, and then you have like kind of more local ones that people maybe engage in. The boycotts that has gotten really famous recently is Starbucks, right? So people have seen the way that Starbucks CEO use their money, and so people have done what the BDS movement calls a common sense boycott of Starbucks, and they said, okay, we're not going to buy Starbucks anymore, and we've seen the shares dip. Same with McDonald's, right? McDonald's wasn't something that was called for as a particular boycott, but people started to see the images of McDonald's giving meals to soldiers in the Israeli military, and said, I'm not going to buy that food, and so we think of ourselves as having kind of consumer power, which is really an interesting way to kind of use the power of people. And there's a lot of that kind of energy around in Montreal if people are interested in trying to figure out like the way to make the boycotts here, the consumer boycotts work. To put a context on it, this has been going on since about 2005, 2006. When a huge group of Palestinian civil society actors all came together and said, okay, world, please help us. We're asking you to boycott Israel and things to do with Israel, to put pressure on them to comply with international law. So the BDS movement is something that's framed with a really liberal framework of international law. So it's not something that's really radical or, out there as kind of an activism thing. It's a really very kind of mainstream movement that says, look, if you comply with international law, we'll stop boycotting you. And for academics, and that's the one that I've been the most involved in, and cultural workers, there's a specific kind of thread of boycott called PACB. So that's the acronym is the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. Mm-hmm. So that's the one that we use. And so it's really looking at how we as academics, people in universities, and cultural workers like musicians and actors and people like that, writers, would specifically boycott Israeli institutions, boycott Israeli universities, not boycott individual people, right? This whole thing isn't about like individual good people who are out there doing good work. This is about an institutional boycott. So I, as a professor, won't go to a conference in Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. I won't do a joint research project with a colleague who works at an Israeli university, even if that colleague is Palestinian and who's working at an Israeli university. I'm not going to do a joint research project that's at a university inside of the 48 borders, right? Wow. The University of Haifa or Ben Gurion University or Hebrew University, the universities that themselves have expropriated Palestinian land and have made their whole structure around the destruction of historic Palestine, right? So that's what the academic and cultural boycott is. So it's really important to think about this as something that we can do in the diaspora, that we who are far can do to support Palestinians in Palestine. It's what they are asking us to do. So when you talk to people about like what can we do, that the pressure that we can put as people far away to try to make the occupation end is this kind of pressure, right? We don't have to buy these products. We don't have to collaborate with these institutions. We can try to shut down the cultural, and that's where the sports question comes in that I mentioned before, right? The cultural exchanges, the sports exchanges, right? The kind of cycling exchanges and so on. We can say we don't want those, to try to pressure them into complying with international law and ending the occupation. So that's the kind of idea of the boycott. But I think it's been really badly understood and kind of also maligned. And so that's why I think it relates to your last question. I was thinking of examples of, of ways in which the movement has been repressed. There has been laws passed in many, many US states that make it illegal to support the BDS movement. So I did work for a publisher a couple of months ago in a state where BDS is illegal. They've actually made it illegal. And so you can't be paid for work at a university if you officially support BDS. So you have to sign on when you hand in your little thing, it says like, okay, I did this work, you fill out an invoice, and then you have to check a box that says, I do not support BDS. The boycott of Israel.
Wow.
So, I just think it's important for people to realize now the amount of money that my contract was worth was $100, and apparently small amounts don't count. So I checked the box, but I still got paid. But if I had done work, I can't remember what the cutoff was. It was much more money than I was going to make. Like I said, I only made $100. But, it's important to realize this, that in the States, they're criminalizing the support of a boycott, right? And a boycott is a kind of a form of protest. Again, it's a peaceful form of protest. It's just withdrawing your support, right? It's withdrawing your either economic consumer power or your intellectual or your other kind of power. There's nothing about it that's very dramatic in a way. It's a very small kind of action. So it's one that I wanted to draw attention to because I think it's important for people to know both how they can participate in this, but also to be aware that there is repression of this as well. Not here, but there is in the States, just across the border.
Well, I mean, eventually, if it succeeds in the U.S., eventually it might come here. And what's good, however, after October 7th and the success of boycotts like McDonald's and Starbucks, especially in the Middle East, people are actually seeing that it's actually working. And that was, I think, one of the main issues with BDS is that people were like, okay, we're going to boycott, but we don't actually see tangible results. But what we saw sadly, with the 8 months of genocide is that after 8 months, companies like McDonald's and Starbucks are actually starting to sweat, and we're actually seeing results, like you mentioned, with the shares going down and the employees that they need to cut to actually make profit. So I'm not sure if you're optimistic, but I'm actually optimistic that actually that's going to work.
Well, again, these are the kinds of tools that we have, right? And we've seen in the case of South Africa that this type of movement did work, right? The international pressure. So if you think about, I guess I have a teenager who watches sports, and so we saw Russia be excluded from sports recently for the role that they played in Ukraine and being excluded from many, many sports. There's a movement in football, like soccer, football, to exclude Israel from from international sporting events, for example. Like these kinds of movements that say, you're not welcome to represent a country when that country is committing genocide is important. And these kinds of things are partly what did push South Africa to end apartheid. And so we're looking to see if a similar kind of international pressure can be exerted.
Okay. It's going to be my last point before the conclusion. I want to know your perspective on how different literature galvanizes resistance in the West versus the East. In a recent discussion on the Katie Halper show, Professor Norm Finkelstein referenced Rousseau's second discourse on equality while talking about the Yemeni blockade of the Red Sea in support of Palestinians. Finkelstein highlighted the profound observation: men would be monsters were it not for the natural feeling of pity. The more educated you become, the more you rationalize not doing anything when others are suffering. If a person gets murdered outside of philosopher's window, the philosopher puts his hand to his ears and says to himself, "Perish if you will, I am safe." The prudent man walks away. It's always the market's woman, or as we say, the fish market woman, who intervenes to break it up. She's reacting to our pity. To me personally, it's not just pity, it's love. But I'm interested in dissecting that interplay between these two different and perhaps contradictory views that both support the Palestinian cause in their own ways. On one hand, students in the West are willing to sacrifice their diplomas and potential future jobs. And on the other hand, the resistance in Yemen is willing to face the might of the U.S. Navy, starvation potentially, to be on the right side of history. How do you see literary work succeeding in galvanizing resistance differently in the West compared to the Middle East? And how do these diverse perspectives converge in their support for Palestine?
It's a big question. You asked a big question, and I think it's interesting. You bring up the idea of pity, you bring up the idea of love, right? And I think that if we want to kind of delve into the human psyche is probably too big of a question for the podcast, but it's interesting, right? Because when I look at kind of all the people that I've talked to in these past months, and like my colleagues and friends, family, students, right? So many people. It is true that people engage the way that they engage, and they do the things that they do for many different reasons, right? We don't all have the same reasons. So there are people who maybe engage this question and think about Palestine in relation to feelings of pity, right? For sure. Some people maybe engage like that, and others from love. And I think, I've seen sort of an outpouring of kind of what I would call something like solidarity, which maybe comes, it's not quite the same as love, but it's connected with that idea too, right? This idea of wanting to have principles and to feel that you are acting according to your principles. I've heard a lot of people talk about, this is not a time, we can't look away, we must face this, we must stand up for this, and people really, really like thinking about themselves as actors in the world and needing to do something, even because we're very far away, right? We're here in Montreal, we're not in Palestine. So we're not, or even Yemen, which is even closer, right? We're really far away geographically, but feeling maybe not far away. And so like, what is the thing that we can do, and wanting to make sure that I've talked to so many younger and older people saying, I have to do the maximum of what I can do, which is a really different way of engaging in politics than maybe we're used to, right? So I think that that's something that when you were feeling optimistic before, that's the thing that makes me feel optimistic, is that so many people are thinking in that way and engaging in that way. But I think that you're right too, in that when you are in a space that feels far, right? So again, here people are from all different origins and all over the world in different backgrounds and so on. So it's a very mixed kind of community that we live in, but we're far, compared to people who are right close by. That there are differences, and those are connected to so many kind of factors. And you bring up the literary one. I think that people when people create literary works, and people engage literary works in a lot of different ways as well. And the way that they relate to those also is informed by those cultural differences that we grow up with, right? And that we are surrounded by, and what our school systems, teach us, and so on. So it's not that they're the same. I don't think that that's exactly the same, but I think that there's something inside of literature that tries to capture the thing that isn't obvious, and it tries to capture it in the thing that makes something literary is the thing that isn't able to be like described at the table or analyzed in the same way that we analyze politics. It's that thing that we can't say directly that makes the work literary itself, right? And that kind of intangible thing is why we spend so much time analyzing literature, because we want to figure out what moves people. Like, what is that thing that moves people? And it's a combination, of course, of the ideas, the way that they're expressed, the language, and we do that in all different ways in different languages and literary traditions and so on. But there is that intangible, special thing that we identify across the world, and that's why we spend so much time analyzing it. And of course, we haven't figured out the exact key, or none of us, people like me don't have a job anymore. But I think that really kind of sitting with and trying to think about what those things are is partly what is the thing that drives humans, all of us, to make the choices that we make, to engage the things that we engage, to commit to the causes that we commit to. So that's kind of why I think that literature and politics are related, right? There is that feeling where you want to be a good person and do the right thing and act according to your principles. It's a similar kind of process to expressing in a work of literature the bigger idea, the more important idea than just the words on the page. That's a bit how I see the connection.
Thank you for that profound answer. In conclusion, what do you believe are the necessary steps to achieve justice and peace for Palestinians under Israeli occupation?
That's an even bigger question that you want me to end with. Well, I think that, that we're seeing right now people doing those things, right? We see the world's attention all being focused on Palestine, and we need to keep the world's attention focused on Palestine until the occupation of all of Palestine ends and Palestinians are free. So we need to keep the focus there. But just watching it isn't obviously enough. And I think many of us are frustrated by that, right, today, because we're watching and we're not seeing an end to it. So we need to find all of those things that we can do. Each of us finds the small things we can do ourselves. So whether that is related to boycotting, or if that is related to making statements, if that is related to doing education, if that's educating in our own families or educating our friends, or the circles that we're in at work, or putting something in our union. If people are a part of a union, you can bring that as a conversation. So we need to do more. All of us who care about these things, we do education. And education doesn't have to be like a book and a class. And education is just talking to people, right? I mean, that's really what education is. But we all have to figure out those ways to do the kind of the witnessing, the education, and the organizing to think about, okay, well, now that we all know about this, what are we going to do to change it? And so here, we're locally where we all need to think about how we can act here where we are. So again, what are the kind of groups of people? How can we make ourselves and group ourselves together to put pressure here to make the bigger changes, so that the sisters and brothers and colleagues and comrades in Palestine will be able to use what we're doing to their own benefits to put an end to all of that.
And thank you very much, Professor Michelle. Hopefully in a few years, who knows, we'll sit down and all of Palestine will be free from the river to the sea.
From the river to the sea. Very nice to meet you, Mustafa. Thanks for inviting me.
It's been a pleasure.